My oaths betray each other till there's nothing left to keep.
Only Us by Miracle of Sound. Alright, and welcome to the Words of Radiance trailer. I am Midnight, your host, and I'm here with Mythic.
Hi.
And Darkness.
Hello.
And we're going to live read the prologue of Words of Radiance, which is called To Question. It says, 6 years ago, Yasna Colon pretended to enjoy the party, giving no indication that she intended to have one of the guests killed. She wandered through the crowded feast hall, listening as wine greased tongues and dimmed minds. Her uncle Dalinar was in the full swing of it, rising from the high table to shout for the Parshendi to bring out their drummers. Yasna's brother, Elhokar, hurried to shush their uncle, though the Alethi politely ignored Dalinar's outburst. All save Elhokar's wife, Aesudan, who snickered primly behind a handkerchief. Yasna turned away from the high table and continued through the room. She had an appointment with an assassin, and she was all too glad to be leaving the stuffy room, which stank of too many perfumes mingling. A quartet of women playing flutes on a raised platform across from the lively hearth, but the music had long since grown tedious. Unlike Dalinar, Yasna drew stares, like flies to rotten meat those eyes were, constantly following her. Whispers like buzzing wings. If there was one thing the Alessi court enjoyed more than wine, it was gossip. Everyone expected Dalinar to lose himself to wine during a feast, but the king's daughter admitting to heresy, that was unprecedented. Yasna has spoken of her feelings for precisely that reason. She passed the Parshendi delegation, which clustered near the high table, talking their rhythmic language. Though the celebration honored them and their treaty they'd signed with Yasna's father, they didn't look festive or even happy. They looked nervous. Of course, they weren't human, and the way they reacted was sometimes odd. Yasna wanted to speak with them, but her appointment would not wait. She intentionally scheduled the meeting for the middle of the feast, and so many would be distracted and drunken. Yasna headed toward the doors, but then stopped in place. Her shadow was pointing in the wrong direction. The stuffy, shuffling, chattering room seemed to grow distant. High Prince Sadeas walked right through the shadow, which quite distinctly pointed toward the sphere lamp on the wall nearby. Engaged in conversation with his companion, Sadeas didn't notice. Yasna stared at the shadow, skin growing clammy, stomach clenched, the way she felt when she was about to vomit. Not again. She searched for another light source, a reason. Could she find a reason? No. The shadow languidly melted back towards her, oozing to her feet and then stretching out the other way. Her tension eased. But had anyone else seen? Blessedly, as she searched the room, she didn't find any aghast stares. People's attention had been drawn by the Parshendi drummers, who were chattering through the doorway to set up. Yasna frowned as she noticed a non-Parshendi servant in loose white clothing helping them. A Shin man? That was unusual. Yasna composed herself. What did these episodes of hers mean? Superstitious folktales she'd read said that misbehaving shadows meant you were cursed. She'd usually dismissed such things as nonsense, but some superstitions were rooted in fact. Her other experiences proved that. She would need to investigate further. The calm, scholarly thoughts felt like a lie compared to the truth of her cold, clammy skin and the sweat trickling down the back of her neck. But it was important to be rational at all times, not just when calm. She forced herself out through the doors, leaving the muggy room for the quiet hallway. She'd chosen the back exit, commonly used by servants. It was the most direct route, after all. Here, master servants dressed in black and white moved on errands from their bright lords or ladies. She had expected that, but had not quite anticipated the sight of her father standing just ahead, in quiet conference with Bright Lord Meritus Amaram. What was the king doing out here? Gavilar Colon was shorter than Amaram, yet the latter stooped shallowly in the king's company. That was common around Gavilar, who would speak with such quiet intensity that you wanted to lean in and listen, to catch every word and implication. He was a handsome man, unlike his brother, with a beard that outlined his strong jaw rather than covering it. He had a personal magnetism and intensity that Yasna felt no biographer had yet managed to convey. Tirim, captain of the king's guard, loomed behind them. He wore Gavilar's shard plate. The king himself had stopped wearing it of late, preferring to entrust it to Tirim, who was known as one of the world's greatest duelists. Instead, Gavilar wore robes of majestic classical style. Yasna glanced back at the feast hall. When had her father slipped out? Sloppy, she accused herself. You should have checked to see if he was still there before leaving. Ahead, he rested his hand on Amaram's shoulder and raised a finger, speaking harshly but quietly, the words indistinct to Yasna. Father? She asked. He glanced at her. Ah, Yasna, retiring so early. It's hardly early, Yasna said, gliding forward. It seemed obvious to her that Gavilar and Amaram had ducked out to find privacy for their discussion. This is the tiresome part of the feast, where the conversation grows louder but no smarter, and were the company drunken. Many people consider that sort of thing enjoyable. Many people, unfortunately, are idiots. Her father smiled. Is it terribly difficult for you, he asked softly, living with the rest of us, suffering our average wits and simple thoughts? It is lonely to be so singular in your brilliance, Yasna. She took it as the rebuke it was, and found herself blushing. Even her mother Navani could not do that to her. Perhaps if you found pleasant associations, Gavlar said, you would enjoy the feasts. His eyes swung toward Amram, who he'd long fancied as a potential match for her. It would never happen. Amram met her eyes, then murmured words of parting to her father and hastened away down the corridor. What errand did you give him? Yasna asked. What are you about this night, father? The treaty, of course. The treaty. Why did he care so much about it? Others had counseled that he either ignore the Parshendi or conquer them. Gavlar insisted upon an accommodation. I should return to the celebration, Gavlar said, motioning to Tiram. The two moved along the hallway toward the doors Yasna had left. Father, Yasna said, what is it that you aren't telling me? He glanced back at her, lingering. Pale green eyes, evidence of his good birth. When had he become so discerning? Storms. She felt as if she hardly knew this man any longer. Such a striking transformation in such a short time. From the way he inspected her, it almost seemed that he didn't trust her. Did he know about her meeting with Liss? He turned away without saying more and pushed back into the party, his guards following. What is going on in this palace, Yasna thought. She took a deep breath. She would have to prod further. Hopefully he hadn't discovered her meeting with assassins. But if he had, she would work with that knowledge. Surely he would see that someone needed to keep watch on the family, as they grew increasingly consumed by his fascination with the Parshendi. Yasna turned and continued on her way, passing a master servant who bowed. After walking a short time in the corridors, Yasna noticed her shadow behaving oddly again. She sighed in annoyance as it pulled toward the 3 stormlight lamps on the walls. Fortunately, she passed from the populated area, and no servants were here to see. All right, she snapped. That's enough. She hadn't meant to speak out loud. However, as the words slipped out, several distant shadows originating in an intersection up ahead stirred to life. Her breath caught. Those shadows lengthened, deepened. Figures formed from them, growing, standing, rising. Stormfather, I'm going insane. One took the shape of a man of midnight blackness, though he had a certain reflective cast, as if he were made of oil. No, of some other liquid with a coating of oil floating on the outside, giving him a dark prismatic quality. He strode toward her and unsheathed a sword. Logic, cold and resolute, guided Yasna. Shouting would not bring help quickly enough, and the inky litheness of this creature bespoke a speed certain to exceed her own. She stood her ground and met the thing's glare, causing it to hesitate. Behind it, a small clutch of other creatures had materialized from the darkness. She had sensed those eyes upon her during the previous months. By now, the entire hallway had darkened, as if it had been submerged and was slowly sinking into lightless depths. Heart racing, breathing quickening, Yasna raised her hand to the granite wall beside her, seeking to touch something solid. Her fingers sank into the stone a fraction, as if the wall had become mud. Oh, storms! She had to do something. What? What could she possibly do? The figure before her glanced at the wall. The wall lamp nearest Yasna went dark, and then the palace disintegrated. The entire building shattered into thousands upon thousands of small glass spheres, like beads. Yasna screamed as she fell backward through a dark sky. She was no longer in the palace. She was somewhere else. Another land, another time, another something. She left with the sight of the dark, lustrous figure hovering in the air above, seeming satisfied as he resheathed his sword. Yasna crashed into something, an ocean of the glass beads. Countless others rained around her, clicking like hailstones into the strange sea. She had never seen this place. She could not explain what had happened or what it meant. She thrashed as she sank into what seemed an impossibility. Beads of glass on all sides. She couldn't see anything beyond them, only she felt herself descending through the churning, suffocating, clattering mass. She was going to die, leaving work unfinished, leaving her family unprotected. She would never know the answers. No! Yasna flailed in the darkness, beads rolling across her skin, getting into her clothing, working their way into her nose as she tried to swim. It was no use. She had no buoyancy in this mess. She raised a hand before her mouth and tried to make a pocket of air to use for breathing, and managed to gasp in a small breath. But the beads rolled around her hand, forced between her fingers. She sank, more slowly now, as through a viscous liquid. Each bead that touched her gave a faint impression of something, a door, a table, a shoe. The beads found their way into her mouth. They seemed to move on their own. They would choke her, destroy her. No, it was just because they seemed attracted to her. An impression came to her, not a distinct thought, but a feeling. They wanted something from her. She snatched a bead in her hand. It gave her an impression of a cup. She gave something to it. The other beads near her pulled together, connecting, sticking like rocks sealed by mortar. In a moment she was falling not among individual beads, but through large masses of them stuck together into the shape of a cup. Each bead was a pattern, a guide for the others. She released the one she held, and the beads around her broke apart. She floundered, searching desperately as her air ran out. She needed something she could use. Something that would help. Some way to survive. Desperate, she swept her arms wide to touch as many beads as she could. A silver platter, a coat, a statue, a lantern, and then something ancient. Something ponderous and slow of thought, yet somehow strong. The palace itself. Frantic, Yasna seized the sphere and forced her power into it. Her mind blurring, she gave this bead everything she had, and then commanded it to rise. Beads shifted, a great crashing sound as beads met one another, clicking, cracking, rattling. It was almost like the sound of a wave breaking on rocks. Yasna surged up from the depths, something solid moving beneath her, obeying her command. Beads battered her head, shoulders, arms, until finally she exploded from the surface of the sea of glass, hurling a spray of beads into a dark sky. She knelt on a platform of glass made up of small beads locked together. She held her hand to the side, uplifted, clutching the sphere that was the guide. Others rolled around her, forming into the shape of a hallway with lanterns on the walls. An intersection ahead. It didn't look right, of course, the entire thing was made of beads. But it was a fair approximation. She wasn't strong enough to form the entire palace. She created only this hallway, without even a roof. But the floor supported her, kept her from sinking. She opened her mouth with a groan, beads falling out to clack against the floor. Then she coughed, drawing in sweet breaths, sweat trickling down the sides of her face and collecting on her chin. Ahead of her, the dark figure stepped up onto the platform. He again slid his sword from his sheath. Yasna held up a second bead, the statue she'd sensed earlier. She gave it power, and other beads collected before her, taking the shape of one of the statues that lined the front of the feast hall. The statue of Telenalat Elin, Herald of War, a tall, muscular man with a large shard blade. It was not alive, but she made it move, lowering its sword of beads. She doubted it could fight. Round beads could not form a sharp sword. Yet the threat made the dark figure hesitate. Gritting her teeth, Yasna heaved herself to her feet, beads streaming from her clothing. She would not kneel before this thing, whatever it was. She stepped up beside the bead statue, knowing for the first time the strange clouds overhead. They seemed to form a narrow ribbon of highway, straight and long, pointing toward the horizon. She met the oil figure's gaze, and regarded her for a moment, then raised 2 fingers to its forehead and bowed, as if in respect, a cloak flourishing out behind. Others had gathered beyond it, and they turned to each other, exchanging hushed whispers. The place of beads faded, and Yasna found herself back in the hallway of the palace, the real one, with real stone, though it had gone dark, the stormlight deadened the lamps on the walls. The only illumination came from far down the corridor. She pressed back against the wall, breathing deeply. I, she thought, need to write this experience down. She would do so, then analyze and consider. Later. Now she wanted to be away from this place. She hurried away with no concern for her direction, trying to escape those eyes she still felt watching. It didn't work. Eventually she composed herself and wiped the sweat from her face with a kerchief. Shadesmar, she thought. That is what it's called in the nursery tales. Shadesmar, the mythological kingdom of the Spren. Mythology she'd never believed. Surely she could find something if she searched the histories well enough. Nearly everything that happened had happened before. The grand lesson of history and... Storms! Her appointment! Cursing to herself, she hurried on her way. That experience continued to distract her, but she needed to make her meeting. So she continued down 2 floors, getting farther from the sounds of the thrumming Parshendi drums until she could hear only the sharpest cracks of their beats. That music's complexity had always surprised her, suggesting that the Parshendi were not the uncultured savages many took them for. This far away, the music sounded disturbingly like the beads from the dark place, rattling against one another. She'd intentionally chosen this out-of-the-way section of the palace for her meeting with Liss. Nobody ever visited this set of guest rooms. A man that Yasna didn't know lounged here, outside the proper door. That relieved her. The man would be Liss's new servant, and his presence meant Liss hadn't left, despite Yasna's tardiness. Composing herself, she nodded to the guard, a Vedan brute with red speckling his beard, and pushed into the room. Liss stood from the table inside the small chamber. She wore a maid's dress, low cut, of course, and could have been a Lethi, or Vedan, or Bav, depending on which part of her accent she chose to emphasize. Long dark hair, worn loose, and a plump, attractive figure made her distinctive in all the right ways. "You're late, Brightness," Liss said. Yasna gave no reply. She was the employer here, and was not required to give excuses. Instead, she laid something on the table beside Liss, a small envelope, sealed with weevil wax. Yasna set 2 fingers on it, considering. No, that was too brash. She didn't know if her father realized what she was doing, but even if he hadn't, too much was happening in this palace. She did not want to commit to an assassination until she was more certain. Fortunately, she prepared a backup plan. She slid a second envelope from the safe pouch inside her sleeve and set it on the table in place of the first. She removed her fingers from it, rounding the table and sitting down. Liss sat back down and made the letter vanish into the bust of her dress. "An odd night, Brightness," the woman said, "to be engaging in treason. I am hiring you to watch only." "Pardon, Brightness, but one does not commonly hire an assassin to watch only." "You have instructions in the envelope," Yasna said, "along with initial payment. I chose you because you are an expert at extended observations. It is what I want, for now. Liz smiled but nodded. Spying on the wife of the heir to the throne? It will be more expensive this way. You sure you don't simply want her dead? Yasna drummed her fingers on the table, then realized she was doing it to the beat of the drums above. The music was so unexpectedly complex, precisely like the Prescendi themselves. Too much is happening, she thought. I need to be very careful. Very subtle. I accept the cost, Yasna replied. In 1 week's time, I will arrange for one of my sister-in-law's maids to be released. You will apply for the position using fake credentials I assume you are capable of producing. You will be hired. From there, you watch and report. I will tell you if your other services are needed. You move only if I say. Understood? You're the one paying, Liz said, a faint bab of dialect showing through. If it showed, it was only because she wished it. Liz was the most skilled assassin Yasna knew. People called her the Weeper, as she gouged out the eyes of the targets she killed. Although she hadn't coined the cognomen, it served her purpose well, since she had secrets to hide. For one thing, nobody knew that the Weeper was a woman. It was said the Weeper gouged the eyes out to proclaim indifference to whether her victims were light-eyed or dark. The truth was the action hid a second secret. Liz didn't want anyone to know that the way she killed left corpses with burned-out sockets. Our meeting is done then, Liz said, standing. Yasna nodded absent-mindedly, again on her bizarre interaction with the Spren earlier. That glistening skin, colors dancing across a surface of the color of tar. She forced her mind away from that moment. She needed to devote her attention to the task at hand. For now, that was Liz. Liz hesitated at the door before leaving. Do you know why I like you, Brightness? I suspect that it has something to do with my pockets and their proverbial depth. Liz smiled. There's that, ain't gonna deny it, but you're also different from the other Light Eyes. When others hire me, they turn up their noses at the entire process. They're all too eager to use my services, but sneer and wring their hands as if they hate being forced to do something utterly distasteful. Assassination is distasteful, Liz. So is cleaning out chamber pots. I can respect the one employed for such jobs without admiring the job itself. Liz grinned, then cracked the door. That new servant of yours outside, Yasna said. Didn't you say they wanted to show him off for me? Talek, Liz said, glancing at the V-man. Oh, you mean the other one? No, Brightness, I sold that one to a slaver a few weeks ago. Liz grimaced. Really? I thought you said he was the best servant you'd ever had. Too good a servant, Liz said. Let's leave it at that. Storming creepy, that Shin fellow was. Liz shivered visibly, then slipped out the door. Remember our first agreement, Yasna said after her. Always there in the back of my mind, Brightness. Liz closed the door. Yasna settled in her seat, lacing her fingers in front of her. Their first agreement was that if anyone should come to Liz and offer a contract on a member of Yasna's family, Liz would let Yasna match the offer in exchange for the name of the one who made it. Liz would do it, probably. So would the dozen other assassins Yasna dealt with. A repeat customer was always more valuable than a one-off contract. And it was in the best interest of a woman like Liz to have a friend in the government. Yasna's family was safe from the likes of these, unless she herself employed the assassins, of course. Yasna let out a deep sigh, then rose, trying to shrug off the weight she felt bearing her down. Wait, did Liz say her old servant was Shin? It was probably a coincidence. Shin people weren't plentiful in the east, but you did see them on occasion. Still, Liz mentioning a Shin man and Yasna seeing one with the Prescendi. Well, there was no harm in checking, even if it meant returning to the feast. Something was off about this night. It's not just because of her shadow and the Spren. Yasna left the small chamber in the bowels of the palace and strode out into the hallway. She turned her steps upward. Above, the drums cut off abruptly, like an instrument string suddenly cut. Was the party ending so early? Dalinar hadn't done something to offend the celebrants, had he? The man and his wine. Well, the Prescendi had ignored his offenses in the past, so they probably would again. In truth, Yasna was happy for her father's sudden focus on a treaty. It meant she would have a chance to study Prescendi traditions and histories at her leisure. Could it be, she wondered, that scholars had been searching the wrong ruins all these years? Words echoed in the hallway, coming from up ahead. I'm worried about Ash. You're worried about everything. Yasna hesitated in the hallway. She's getting worse, the voice continued. We weren't supposed to get worse. Am I getting worse? I think I feel worse. Shut up. I don't like this. What we've done was wrong. That creature carries my lord's own blade. We shouldn't have let him have it. The two passed through the intersection ahead of Yasna. They were ambassadors from the west, including the Azish man with the white birthmark on his cheek. Or was it a scar? The shorter of the two men, he could have been a Lethi, cut off when he noticed Yasna. He let out a squeak, then hurried on his way. The Azish man was the one dressed in black and silver, stopped and looked her up and down, then frowned. Is the feast over already? Yasna asked down the hallway. Her brother had invited these two to the celebration, along with every other ranking foreign dignitary in Kholinar. Yes, the man said. His stare made her uncomfortable. She walked forward anyway. I should check further into these two, she thought. She'd investigated their backgrounds, of course, and found nothing of note. Had they been talking about a shard blade? Come on, the shorter man said, returning and taking the taller man by the arm. He allowed himself to be pulled away. Yasna walked to where the corridors crossed, then watched them go. Where once drums had sounded, screams suddenly rose. Oh no. Yasna turned with alarm, then grabbed her skirt and ran as hard as she could. A dozen different potential disasters raced through her mind. What else could happen on this broken night, when shadows stood up and her father looked upon her with suspicion? Nerves stretched thin, she reached the steps and started climbing. It took her far too long. She could hear the screams as she climbed and finally emerged into chaos. Dead bodies in one direction, a demolished wall in the other. How? The destruction led toward her father's rooms. The entire palace shook, and a crunch echoed from the direction. No, no, no. She passed shard-blade cuts on the stone walls as she ran. Please. Corpse with burned eyes, bodies littering the floor like discarded bones at the dinner table. Not this. A broken doorway, her father's quarters. Yasna stopped in the hallway, gasping. Control yourself. Control. She couldn't. Not now. Frantic, she ran to the quarters through a shard, though a shardbearer would kill her with ease. She wasn't thinking straight. She should get someone who could help. Dalinar? He'd be drunk. Sadeas, then. The room looked like it had been hit by a high storm. Furniture in shambles, splinters everywhere. The balcony doors were broken outward. Someone lurched toward them, a man in her father's shardplate. Tiram, the bodyguard? No, the helm was broken. It was not Tiram, but Gavilar. Someone on the balcony screamed. Father! Yasna shouted. Gavilar hesitated as he stepped out onto the balcony, looking back at her. The balcony broke beneath him. Yasna screamed, dashing through the room with the broken balcony, falling to her knees at the edge. Wind tugged locks of hair loose from her bun as she watched the two men fall. Her father and the Shin Man in white from the feast. The Shin Man glowed with a white light. He fell onto the wall. He hit it, rolling, then came to a stop. He stood up, somehow remaining on the outer palace wall and not falling. It defied reason. He turned, then stalked towards her father. Yasna watched, growing cold, helpless as the assassin stepped down to her father and knelt over him. Tears fell from her chin, and the wind caught them. What was he doing down there? She couldn't make it out. When the assassin walked away, he left behind her father's corpse, impaled on a length of wood. He was dead. Indeed, his shardblade had appeared beside him, as they all did when the bearers died. I worked so hard, Yasna whispered, numb. Everything I did to protect this family. How? Liss had done this. No. Yasna wasn't thinking straight. That Shin Man, she wouldn't have admitted to owning him in such a case. She'd sold him. We are sorry for your loss. Yasna spun, blinking bleary eyes. 3 Parshendi, including Clade, stood in the doorway in their distinctive clothing. Neatly stitched cloth wraps for both men and women. Sashes at the waist, loose shirts with no sleeves. Hanging vests, open at the sides, woven in bright colors. They didn't segregate clothing by gender. She thought they did by caste, however, and stop it, she told herself. Stop thinking like a scholar for one storming day. We take responsibility for his death, said the foremost Parshendi. Gagna was female, though with the Parshendi the gender differences seemed minimal. The clothing hid breasts and hips, neither of which were ever very pronounced. Fortunately, the lack of a beard was a clear indication. All the Parshendi men she'd ever seen had beards, which they wore tied with bits of gemstone and— Stop it! What did you say? Yasna demanded, forcing herself to her feet. Why would it be your fault, Gagna? Because we hired the assassin, the Parshendi woman said in a heavily accented sing-song voice. We killed your father, Yasna Colon. You— Emotion suddenly ran cold, like a river freezing in the heights. Yasna looked from Gagna to Clade to Varnali. Elders, all 3 of them, members of the Parshendi ruling council. Why? Yasna whispered. Because it had to be done, Gagna said. Why? Yasna demanded, stalking forward. He fought for you. He kept the predators at bay. My father wanted peace, you monsters. Why would you betray us now, of all times? Gagna drew her lips to a line. The song of her voice changed. She seemed almost like a mother explaining something very difficult to a small child. Because your father was about to do something very dangerous. Send for bright Lord Dalinar, a voice outside in the hall shouted. Storms! Did my orders get to Elhokar? The crown prince must be taken to safety. High Prince Sadeas stumbled into the room along with a team of soldiers. His bulbous, ruddy face was wet with sweat, and he wore Gavilar's clothing, the regal robes of the office. What are the savages doing here? Storms, protect Princess Yasna! The one who did this, he was in their retinue. The soldiers moved to surround the Parshendi. Yasna ignored them, turning and stepping back to the broken doorway. Hand on the wall, looking down at her father's blade on the rocks below, blade beside him. There will be war, she whispered, and I will not stand in its way. This is understood, Gagna said from behind. The assassin, Yasna said. He walked on the wall. Gagna said nothing. In the shattering of her world, Yasna caught hold of this fragment. She had seen something tonight, something that should not have been possible. Did it relate to the strange spren, her experience in the place of glass beads in a dark sky? These questions became her lifeline for stability. Sadeas demanded answers from the Parshendi leaders. He received none. When he stepped up beside her and saw the wreckage below, he went barreling off, shouting for his guards, and running down below to reach the fallen king. Hours later, it was discovered that the assassination and the surrender of the 3 Parshendi leaders had covered the flight of the larger portion of their number. They escaped the city quickly, and the cavalry Dalinar sent after them were destroyed. 100 horses, each nearly priceless, lost among with their riders. The Parshendi leaders said nothing more and gave no clues, even when they were strung up, hanged for their crimes. Yasna ignored all that. Instead, she interrogated the surviving guards on what they had seen. She followed leads about the now famous assassin's nature, prying information from Liss. She got almost nothing. Liss had owned him only a short time and claimed she hadn't known about his strange powers. Yasna couldn't find the previous owner. Next came the books, a dedicated, frenzied effort to distract her from what she had lost. That night, Yasna had seen the impossible. She would learn what it meant. So that was that very long prologue.
Very long.
The way that I forgot you were reading for a moment, and I thought I was listening through like an audiobook. Yeah.
So what did you think about getting the night that we got from the first prologue in the first book from Yasna's point of view this time?
That I hope that every book from this point forward is going to be a different person's perspective at that point.
It is!
Hey, wonderful.
We get an epilogue with Wit, and we get the prologue of different versions of the Night of Gavilar's death.
Is that all this book is going to be?
All about that death? Yeah, for sure.
It better not be, because I swear to God, I'm going to be so upset.
No, it continues from the last book.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, we got a lot in there. What did you think about Yasna's experience with those strange inky spren?
Ink spren.
Darkness spren.
Yeah.
It's me.
They're your spren for sure, darkness. Yep.
I would love darkness spren.
I bet you would.
Also, what did you think about the now that you've actually seen the Parshendi take accountability for Gavilar's murder? Because you guys weren't 100% sure they really had.
I mean, did they though really like?
Yeah, they said that they sent the assassin to kill him because her father was going to do something very dangerous.
Okay, but that makes more sense.
However, is it true though? Or are they lying to her?
It's a good question.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Did they really send the assassin?
I mean, they allowed themselves to get killed for it. Those three leaders.
And to be fair, if it was to stop something that bad, then I mean it makes sense.
There are worse things than death.
Yeah.
Also, what do you think about that little conversation between Amaram and Gavilar that we didn't really hear?
I mean, maybe. I don't know, but oh.
I'm not really sure what to think about it, to be honest.
Well, we know it's the same dude that fucked over Kaladin, right?
Yeah, that's the guy that fucked over Kaladin, and he also knows about the Ghost Bloods.
He's probably
and his brother was part of it then.
Well, so we don't know. In the prologue of the Way of Kings, Gavilar asks Szeth a couple names of who Szeth might be working for, and Szeth says he's not working for any of them, he's working for the Parshendi. So let me see if I can find the names of... Oh, he asked if it's Thydakar, Ristaris, or Sadius, and Szeth says it's none of them. So he doesn't list any names of any organizations, he lists the names of 3 people, one being Sadius.
No, but that's what I'm saying, what if he's part of the...
Yeah, so he could be part of the Ghost Bloods. He could be part of something that's working against the Ghost Bloods. We don't know who those Ristaris and Thydakar are. We don't know if they're part of an organization we know about or if they're from somewhere else. Yeah, so that's the prologue. Feel free to read over it again on your own, because I know sometimes the live read is a bit hard for you to take in everything. And for our first episode of Words of Radiance, we'll be reading chapters 1 through 4. So please look forward to that, and thank you to everyone for listening. Bye.
Yep, bye.
Bye.